Professor Little, anything you want to know, if you want clarification on a particular point, or if you want to pose a counter argument, anything you'd like to ask, we'll have a period where anybody can answer or can ask those questions. Following that question and answer period, we'll open it up to the audience. We'll have a student-led debate where you all get a chance to voice your opinions, make your arguments about our question, does your vote matter? So following that discussion, once it's kind of exhausted and things start to wind down, we'll have a vote. And everybody here will get a chance to cast a ballot on one side of our question. Does your vote matter, yes or no? And so once that vote has been tallied, that will be our resolution, which will be published on our website, Cornell Political Union. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker briefly. Professor Little is Assistant Professor of Government here at Cornell. He earned a master's from Carleton College and his PhD from NYU. In his research here focuses specifically on the politics of information. So with that, everybody, please give a round of applause to Professor Little.
Again, thank you all for coming, particularly during finals period when you may have a lot of things going on. So I'm going to start with a brief story. And so this is taken a few weeks ago. And so what's going on here is that the two gentlemen kind of in the foreground on the right were the Republican and Democratic candidates for a Mississippi State House of Representatives. And I believe in Jackson, Mississippi was the actual location of the seat. And so so during this election, both candidates received exactly 4,589 votes. So there was an exact tie in this election. And so what Mississippi state law says is that in the event of a tie, the way that the winner is determined is by drawing straws. And so that's actually what they're doing here. It's kind of hard to see, but they're sort of picking a short or long straw, which is going to determine who's going to win this house seat. And so you may just say, oh, whatever, this is the Mississippi State House, who cares? It's probably just a bunch of Republicans, it's probably not close anyways. So it's partially true. So the Mississippi State House is about 60% Republican. Not particularly close for determining a majority, but they also, as I'm sure you all know, in the Mississippi State House, there was a rule that any budgetary bill needs exactly 60% of the House to pass. And so the winner of this, who won this drawing straws, is actually going to determine whether the Republicans have a supermajority which will allow them to pass any budget bill with a straight party. But in fact, the Democratic candidate won the drawing of the straws, and so now when Republicans want to pass a budget, they actually need the support of one Democrat in order to get it. So why is this? So obviously, the reason why this is sort of interesting to us is not because we care a tremendous amount about the budgets of the state of Mississippi. For Mississippi, that's not sort of a great national interest. But this is sort of interesting, particularly because this is such an incredibly rare event. When people's vote not only determines who sort of might win a political race, but actually might influence policy through this particular supermajority rule. And so if you you go on Wikipedia and look for a list of tied elections, and you'll see that throughout the world this happens extremely rarely. I think actually this happened after I was asked to give this talk, and I had to find some obscure reference to the Philippines before I get to this. So the fact that this happened is, we'll see if this is good or bad for my case. And so I want to make sort of one more point in this case, which is that so people's sort of vote mattered in the sense that any one person who voted in this election, if they had abstained, that would have changed the outcome. Right? It would have gone from a tie and a 50-50 shot of who would win to one candidate winning absolutely. Similarly, anyone who abstained from voting could have gone out and voted. This is a very off-cycle election, so I'm guessing voter turnout was probably very low in this election. So it was probably only, I didn't actually check the numbers, but I would guess probably around 30% turnout. So anyone who sort of sat at home could have shown up, voted, and sort of swung the outcome of this election. But again, maybe changed budgetary rules. So elections that are perfectly tied are not the only ones where your vote can sort of theoretically matter. So if you had, so if we take it away, so if the Democratic candidate had won by one vote, then so people who voted for the Republican couldn't change the election outcome, right? Because they're already voting for the Republican lost by one vote. But anyone who didn't vote could vote for the Republican and switch it to a tie, and anyone who voted for the Democrat could also change their vote. So really, the only time that people's votes are going to matter for sort of affecting who's going to win is sort of when either there's an exact tie or it's a tie plus or minus one vote. So we might want to ask, okay, so how likely is that to happen? So let's sort of start with a very simple sort of model of the likelihood of someone's voting matter in this way. And so the simplest way to think of this is just sort of suppose we know the size of the electorate. And I'll show you a graph in a second. But say we know there's 100 people who are going to vote. And let's say we know that everyone is going to vote for the Democratic candidate with probability 1. So it's a completely split electorate in the sense that on average, 50% of people are going to vote for the Republican. And so this ends up being a simple application. If anyone's taking a probability class, this is just a simple application of what's called the binomial theorem. It's actually equivalent to saying, if you flip 100 coins, what's the probability that there's going to be 49, 50, or 51 heads? With some adjustment to the fact that when there's 49 heads, not anyone can change things. So here's a picture of what that looks like. So I'm plotting on the x-axis here the size of the electorate by powers of 10, so sort of a logarithm in the x-axis. So we're starting at 10 to the power of 1 or 10. So this is 10 to 100, 1,000, all the way up to 10 to the power of 8, I believe is 10 billion voters. And this is the probability that an individual vote would change the outcome of this election. And so actually, with an electorate of 10, your chance of influencing the outcome of the election is actually quite high, right? Because you can think, just think that if you flip a coin 10 times, there's a reasonably good chance that there's going to be 4, 5, or 6 heads. That's not a particularly unlikely thing to happen. Once you get up to 100, then your chance of your vote mattering goes down quite a bit, right? So if you flip a coin 100 times, the chance of getting 499, 500, or 501 heads is sort of shrinks to a smaller number, a bit over 10%. Once we get up to electorates of around 10,000 or 1 million, this chance becomes pretty well approximated on 0. So I think if you go up to an electorate of say 10 million, then your chance of affecting the election ends up being about 1 in 100,000. So that may not sound, too crazily low, but so notice that this is a sort of very specific example where, in fact, the electorate is completely split between, say, the Republican and the Democrat. So what happens if maybe things are a bit asymmetric? So what if, say, you think that 52% of the people support the Republican, sort of on average, sort of an expectation? Well now, so that doesn't affect things very much in small electorates, but now we're getting down to a chance of about 0 of the vote mattering, even when we get up to an electorate of, say, 10,000. It's sort of almost completely impossible for your vote to matter. Now let's change that to 55%. Now even when we get down to an electorate of about 100, the chance of a single vote mattering essentially becomes 0. So obviously this is sort of a bit of a contrived example, talking about flipping coins and numbers of heads. So let's move to a more consequential example of thinking about the probability that your vote is going to matter in a U.S. presidential election. And so the data I'm going to show you is from the 2008 election, but it's probably not tremendously different, say, in this coming election. So there's a couple interesting, obviously, institutional features about the United States that affect this question. And in particular, I forgot if I used this word yet, but we often refer to these in game theory as pivot probabilities. So when my vote matters, is sort of a pivot event. And so a pivot probability is the chance that sort of individual vote matters. So obviously, an interesting thing about the United States electoral system is that we have the Electoral College. And so there's, in a sense, kind of 2 pivots going on when you're voting, right? So the first pivot is my vote may change whether my state supports a particular candidate in the Electoral College. Setting aside, I think Maine and Nebraska have different rules. But in most states, New York, whoever wins the most votes in New York gets all of New York's electoral votes. So that's sort of pivot number 1 is you shift what happens in New York. And then pivot number 2 is do New York's electoral votes change the outcome of the election? Right? So there's actually kind of 2 layers necessary for your vote to matter in a presidential election. So this is from a paper by Gelman Silver, that's actually Dave Silver, 548, and Aaron Edlin. And so they sort of come up with a pretty realistic model of sort of what we're uncertain about. We may not know how many people are going to vote. We don't know necessarily exactly what Obama's sort of support was leading up to the election in 2008. So they write sort of a pretty sophisticated model of this. and compute the probability that an individual vote is going to matter in every state. And so what we're looking at here is how, just looking at how the number of electoral votes you have affects your chance of your vote mattering. And so it may seem surprising at first that there's generally a negative correlation here. So the reason why there's a negative correlation here is because small states are overrepresented in the electoral college, right? Because so your electoral college votes is equal to your number of senators plus members of the House. And so even tiny states get 3 votes because everyone has 2 senators. And so in fact, the small states tend to be overrepresented. So that's why there's sort of a general negative trend. And so anyone from New Mexico? No, not too bad. So in 2008 at least, the state where your vote was most likely to matter was in fact New Mexico. And looking at the y-axis here, that was about, so if you were in New Mexico, there was about a 1 in 10 million chance that your vote might have changed the outcome. New Hampshire, Virginia, Colorado are the other kind of 3 where it's a little bit higher. And then we get down here to say New York, where New York is in fact so low that it's kind of impossible to see on the scale. So this graph gives you a different scale, which is a bit helpful. It is also looking at the sort of expected Obama vote share and how that affects things. And so notice the states where your vote is most likely to matter are the ones that are sort of in the middle. And that's because of that sort of second pivot. So for example, if your vote became pivotal in Texas, then if Texas is close, then Obama must be winning by so much there's almost no chance that the election is going to be close, right? Because technically sort of know that Texas is quite Republican, so if Texas is close, the election is not going to be close at all. So the sort of the states where your vote's most likely to matter tend to be kind of the small ones that are relatively in the middle in terms of how Republican or Democrat they are. But again, sort of the peak here is about 1 in 10 million. I think this is New York and here. And so New York, the probability their vote would affect the outcome is about 1 times 10 to the power of -9. So I think it's 1 in a billion. So not that big. So it seems, I mean, just sort of the raw numbers, in particular presidential elections, just seem completely decisive on the fact that your vote, the chance that you're going to, affect who becomes the president by voting is just very well approximated. To go back to our original example, well, so you might say, okay, well maybe in sort of smaller elections it's going to matter more. And that's true. So in that particular Mississippi House race, there actually was a tie in sort of individual votes, did sort of matter in that particular election. But notice that even within people who were voting for the Mississippi House, there was in fact tons of other people who were voting for in different districts whose votes weren't pivotal in any way. So even if we pick this sort of very specific election, where we knew that this tie happened, only a very small proportion of Mississippi voters even had their vote matter. And again, on an election that's sort of maybe not the most important in terms of affecting people's lives. So really sort of the only elections that are particularly consequential are going to be the ones with kind of small electorates. And so, sure, if the question is, does your vote matter, say, if you guys are voting for your next president and there's a split and there's only 10 votes, then yeah, sure, I'll grant you your vote may sort of matter there. But in kind of most of the elections that we care about, if what you're interested in is am I going to change who wins the election, essentially the answer to this question is no. And if you like math, this is just another instance. So I think the lighter colors are the states where you're more likely to matter, the darker ones where so you can see where you're from, the darker it is, then you might as well just show it. So for now, I've only been talking about the chance that you're going to shift the outcome of an election. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the related question of whether, if this is sort of what you care about, should you vote? And this question is actually not exactly the same. So this right here, this is one of the more famous formulas in political science. It's a very exciting one, which is that you can think that it's going to be sort of rational to vote to influence the outcome of an election if this inequality holds. If P times B is greater than C. So what do we mean here? So the P here is what I've just been talking about, is the probability that you're going to influence the outcome. You can think of the B as sort of the difference between the sort of first, just think for now, two-candidate election, sort of the difference in how much you like each candidate is what B is representing, right? So if you're sort of purely, maybe purely monetarily, if all you care about is, your take-home income, and maybe the Republicans are going to give you a lower tax rate, then D might represent, the difference in my take-home income under the tax rate that a Democrat would pass versus the tax rate that a Republican would pass. So that's what D might be. Obviously, you could represent other things as well. And then C is going to be the cost of voting. Right? And so the cost of voting is essentially your time. And so, how much time? Well, I think so here, in Ithaca, the lines tend not to be too crazy. But in general, it's going to cost you, in terms of the time it takes to get to the polling station, wait in line, get your ballot, fill your ballot out, put it in, drive away. You're probably talking, at least about half an hour. That seems to be a sort of a lower bound of how much time it's going to take to vote. And so we'll sort of think through what this means. So if the cost of voting is half an hour of your time, and let's say we are in one of these states where, again, at best, it seemed like in a presidential election, the chance of your vote mattering was about 1 in 10 million. So T is about 1 in 10 million, and C is, we're measuring sort of our cost of benefits in hours, half an hour. Then we need the benefit of swinging the election to be about, what does it work out? It works out to be about 5 million hours of your time. However much you value 5 million hours of your time. 5 million hours of your time is about 500 years. And so we're actually talking about greater than your lifespan of how much you need to value changing the election in order to make it worthwhile to vote, given those values of P and C. And so to make sort of an extreme example of this, if sort of there was a measure on the ballot that was nationwide, and the measure on the ballot was a referendum on, should we execute Andrew Little? And I thought there was about 10 million people were going to vote, and it was going to be a sort of close election. It would probably not be worth my time to show up and vote against my own execution. That's sort of how small the chance of me affecting the election is. So if we're thinking, if the reason why I vote is to affect outcomes, and then the question is, should you vote? Sort of moving a bit beyond the question of whether your vote matters. The answer is almost certainly no to that question as well, if you sort of care about if you care about affecting these outcomes. Do you know how much time am I going to? You're fine. Yeah. So we'll think about maybe some counterarguments. So you might say that this sort of PD minus C or PD greater than C isn't sort of the right way to think about this, and that the reason why you should vote is that your vote kind of matters for fulfilling a civic duty or being a part of a democratic society. And I think that's sort of a bit of a dodge, right? Because you might think that voter turnout is some sort of measure of the health of our democracy. But again, your vote is only going to be a completely negligible decimal point effect on voter turnout. So even if you think it's really important that people turn out to vote, you're going to have almost zero impact on voter turnout, and so really you're not going to be hurting or harming democracy by deciding to vote. So another kind of interesting counterargument is to say, okay, well, what if everyone thinks like this? What if everyone thinks that my vote doesn't matter? And then almost no one's going to show up. And if 0 people show up, I can tell you, we can compute pretty quickly the probability your vote matters. It's going to be 1, right? If no one else votes, then your vote is going to completely determine what happens. So this is sort of clever. And actually, so game theory models are very well suited to answer questions like this. And thinking about, okay, if other people are more or less likely to vote, should I be more or less likely to vote? So it's generally true that the fewer people vote, the more my vote is likely to matter. And so in a sense, if no one else is going to vote, then yeah, I should definitely go out and vote. That can affect the outcome. But I can say with reasonable confidence that 2016 is not going to be the election where everyone collectively decides, never mind, I don't think my vote matters, and only 10 people show up, and those 10 people's votes matter a lot. If you think that's going to happen, I'll take a bet. It's very unlikely to happen. So the plain fact is most people don't think like this. Most people this argument has sort of been around for 40 years. And so I don't think everyone's going to be persuaded by this, and come next election, there's probably still going to be quite a bit of turnout, and you're going to have a little chance of changing it. So maybe the most interesting counterargument is to say, well, all right, fine, you can be clever, you can show me these binomial theorem probabilities, but the plain fact is that people do vote, and if people do vote, that means that it sort of mustn't matter to them. There must be some reason why their vote matters. So let's think through why people do actually vote. And this is sort of one of the most heavily studied topics in political science over the past 30 years. So there's sort of a few theories. The first of which are theories where your vote does matter, in a sense where you're voting for instrumental reasons. So one of them is that what you care about is not sort of this expected benefit of voting, but maybe you care about minimizing the vote margin, right? So you might think that if I were to not go out and vote, and we were to get a tied election, I would just feel terrible that I missed an opportunity for my vote to matter. And so if that's the criteria you want to use, that I want to avoid sort of terrible things, and I think it's terrible to avoid voting in a post-election, then sure, then yeah, maybe you might want to vote. But I think that's just sort of not a very good model for human behavior, right? So when you sort of get up in the morning and decide, am I going to go to class, am I going to go to a party, you might get run over on the road. That's a possibility that's going to happen, and that probably doesn't stop you from going to class, or going to a party, or going out. So really, this idea that we should be that concerned about this extremely rare event, I just don't find it persuasive. Another idea is that maybe I can, my individual vote won't matter, but maybe I can sort of persuade 10, 20 of my friends to go out. So that might be true. You might be able to be persuasive. You might be able to go down your dorm, knock on walls, and say, hey, let's go vote. But still, when the probabilities of one vote mattering are around 1 in 10 billion, getting that down to 1 in 100 billion, if you get 10 people to vote, you're still kind of in the range where it's sort of so unlikely to not be worth it. And further, that's also more costly, right? For you to go around and try and persuade people, that's more of your time. You may piss people off. You may sort of lose some friends, and it's sort of probably not worth it to do that as well. But one theory that I think is particularly technically clever, even if not quite as meaningful, is we might think that what matters isn't only the act of who wins elections, but that vote shares might matter too, right? So we often talk about sort of someone having a mandate, meaning that if the president sort of wins an election by a lot of votes, maybe they're going to have an easier time passing their agenda. So that's sort of one way that your vote might matter, right? So I may not change who wins the election, but I know that I'm going to up that vote total by a vote. So it's certainly going to be the case that you're going to sort of shift the vote margin a bit, and maybe that's going to make it easier for certain bills to get passed. There's actually sort of very clever and very technical paper that shows that this effect tends to be much bigger than this sort of affecting who wins effect, but only on the order of about 10 times bigger. And so again, when we're talking about these sort of the benefits of voting were so swamped by the cost initially that changing things by an order of 10 is probably not going to change our general conclusion that maybe I'm going to knock Obama's vote share up by 1, but that's sort of probably going to make almost no difference. So why do people actually vote? So I think there's really 2 reasons why people actually vote. And so one of them comes from modified discriminant, is now we're going to add a D to this topic. Or you might think that D is sort of your civic duty, or sort of whether you sort of enjoy voting, right? You might just think that again, if you personally think it's important, I'm going to be happier if I go out and vote. I might feel guilty if I don't go out and vote, and therefore I'm going to get sort of some intrinsic value out of this. And so my favorite reason why I think this is kind of a good explanation is to look at the fact that people not only vote in presidential elections, but about as many people voted for the winner in American Idol. Actually, I think this is actually a not really fair comparison, because people can vote multiple times for American Idol. But the general order of magnitude is about the same. And so, obviously, it is not going to affect your life that much who wins a particular season of American Idol. That's probably not really a particularly consequential thing, and people are still deciding to vote. And so we wouldn't think to say, oh, why are these idiots voting? It's not going to matter. Well, because, they like a particular singer, and they want to support them. And they just sort of enjoy doing it. So I think sort of the sheer enjoyment or guilt for not voting is probably just one reason why people actually do. The second reason is going back to the case where maybe go knock around doors and bug people is social pressure, right? So you might sort of if your friends know that you didn't go vote, then they sort of look down upon you for that. So a reason why I think this is a particularly good explanation is that one of the most powerful experiments that's been done on voter turnout, and sort of the biggest way to get people to vote is to do this. Which is, so as we may, I don't know if you know this, but whether you vote or not is a matter of public record. Right? So obviously who you vote for, your actual ballot is secret, but anyone can go to the county registrar and find out whether you voted. And so this is an experiment that was done, I think, about 10 years ago, where what people did was they sent out some postcards. So some people, they sent a postcard that said something like, it's important to vote for your civic duty. Some people got no postcard. And some people got a postcard that said this, that said, it's a matter of public record whether you vote. Here's a list of your, it actually goes much longer, here's a list of your neighbors, and whether or not they voted in the last 2 elections. And we're going to send out this postcard again after the election, and everyone's going to know whether or not you voted. And so this postcard increased turnout by about 10%, which is, again, by far the largest effect that anyone's been able to uncover for effective turnout. So clearly, sort of, the worry that my neighbors, might look down upon me if I don't vote, seems to be something that matters to them. So sort of, again, combining these two things, and there's just sort of tons written about this. Really, I think kind of the most persuasive reasons for why people actually vote is just for sort of intrinsic benefit and social pressure, which are I think not how I would interpret the question of whether to vote matters. People are not voting because they think it's sort of important how they vote, but because either they enjoy it or they're kind of worried or they don't like it. So I think I have another point I want to make, but I think it might make more sense to stop here and see if what you all think.
Now open up to questions. Yeah.
So you mentioned the argument about vote counts because it's democratic. But what about the argument that it matters because it gives people a sense of empowerment? I mean, obviously there's been so many movements, feminist movement, civil rights movement, to just get the ability to vote. Obviously it's a big issue about voter registration ID laws because some people can interpret it as that kind of restricting your freedom of expression. Even though it might not mathematically matter, isn't it important to at least give people the sense that they are empowered and they can influence?
So I think that's just partly a matter of interpretation. So if you interpret the question as does my vote matter for me personally in whether I'm expressing my political opinions, then yeah, sure, then I would say that sort of that matters. Again, the way I'm interpreting the question is sort of whether individual votes matter for that aggregate outcomes. Because in a way, that's sort of if the question is does the decision for me to vote matter at all? Then the answer just has to be yes, right? Because obviously some people make this decision, and so by definition, then it's going to sort of matter. And so in a way, I'm trying to frame the question in a way that's, I think, a bit more potentially controversial, even though, again, I think the answer is no, which is that I sort of wouldn't count that as sort of meaning that your vote matters. People may disagree with that interpretation, but I think that sort of fits in with some of the motivations for voting that I would not say that your vote matters. Yeah.
How would you explain, the 2000 elections between Bush and Gore, in which there were certain counties in Florida where literally the vote went down to in the hundreds? So were people in those particular areas having their vote matter more, or is this just an indication that maybe our votes do matter more, and we're just not as aware?
So it's certainly true that your vote, again, so we go back to our graphic. So this was 2008, and I don't think the story would have been too much different in 2000. So Florida is a place that where it's relatively likely for your vote to matter. It's a large state, but it's also a relatively balanced sort of in the middle state. But again, so first of all, I think Bush v. Gore was one of the, if not the closest, I think one of the three closest elections in U.S. In presidential elections in U.S. history. So first it's sort of extremely rare that things get that close. And then, we're only looking at what's happening in Florida, which is maybe 10% of the population. And then we're only looking at these kind of few counties where it looks like things are close. And then even then, the margins are still on the order of 100, right? So sort of we're getting kind of layers of unlikely upon unlikely upon unlikely upon unlikely. And so sure, there are going to be in some states, in some elections, where your vote is relatively likely to matter. But even in sort of those best case scenarios, it's sort of so unlikely that I think sort of the simpler answer is just say, as a first order approximation, the chances.
We explain it as the magic formula. So the idea that PV is greater than C explains whether you should vote. Can some of the problem be that C is just too high? That registration in some states you have to register months before, or it's just sometimes registration and voting itself is just too laborious or too tedious. So if we somehow decrease C somehow, whether it's make voting day a national holiday or tax breaks for people to vote, wouldn't that incentivize people to vote and make it more?
Yeah. So I think that's completely right. So there's certainly evidence to show that. For those who don't know, there's actually quite a bit of sort of registering to vote is determined on a state-by-state basis. So there are some states where you can just sort of show up with a driver's license and vote on the spot. Actually, the first time I voted when I was in college, I was in Minnesota, and that's literally what I did. I mean, I showed up with like my driver's license and my college ID, and that was enough. They signed me up, and there was nothing to happen. I think some states that are on the other extreme are, I think like Texas is one that's very difficult. And was the site of a sort of contentious court decision about whether, I think it was whether you needed a driver's license. Is that what that court case was about? Something about whether you needed particular forms of ID and had to sort of register ahead of time. And that's certainly, so stuff like that certainly makes voting more costly. And I don't think that, but that's sort of not inconsistent with the statement that even if sort of changing C affects people's likelihood of voting, so if you think that sort of D is maybe, random, that people have higher or lower Ds, then pretty much all of whether they decide to vote or not is going to be decided by just is D greater than C. Right? So the sort of whether their vote matters is sort of, it doesn't affect their propensity to vote, even if sort of changing C changes their propensity to vote. So I think sort of that evidence is just sort of not inconsistent with the main point. Right?
So like voter turnout has been decreasing over a lot of years, and it's just continually seeming to go from a downward trend. Do you think that is something that is bad, or do you think that is just voters perhaps even being more intelligent about the worth of their time, the worth of their vote, and maybe not doing the mathematical equation, but doing a more qualitative equation, and guys seeing that it really isn't worth voting?
I think that's possible. I mean, again, I don't think. I think what's what really is going to be driving people's turnout is this C and D term. And so, it could be the case that people sort of value their time more. It could be the case that people are kind of, so I think it's certainly the case that people, at least in the United States, obviously, of course, I'm using the US as an example, but the general rule applies, basically. And so, I think people are getting more disaffected with the political system, and so if you're more disaffected with the political system, then, maybe you sort of don't particularly care which candidate wins, and that's going to sort of lower it. If I don't really care who wins, then why would I even feel that it matters for my civic duty if I hate those candidates? So I mean, whether that's good or not, I mean, I think that's sort of a separate question, whether it would be good if turnout were higher. I mean, actually, think despite what I said, I'm not convinced that the answer to that is no, that you should be okay with the fact that people are voting. Obviously, when turnout goes down, so let's say, so I mean, a perfect example is say the cost of voting goes up because we introduce some requirement that's hard for some people to meet. So almost always, those some people are going to be poor people. And poor people obviously have different political preferences, right? They care about different tax rates, they want different things now. And so by making it harder to vote and changing the electorate, that actually may lead to different policies that maybe don't represent what people want so much. And so certainly on the aggregate, I think that's not necessarily a good thing. But again, I don't think that really speaks to the question of whether individually, you should be thinking about whether your vote's going to, whether your vote's going to back off. Yeah.
So, Professor Little, do you vote?
Well, you're pushing me towards the other point I was getting. So I usually do. I didn't vote in the past local elections. I think I voted in every presidential election where I've been eligible to vote in some midterm elections.
Yeah, that's also like kind of counterintuitive because your vote is more likely to matter on a local level than a presidential level. But I think that a lot of people have that same thing because you see like midterm elections and presidential elections.
Yes.
Presidential elections are way high and then midterms go down and the presidential election and it goes down again for midterm elections.
I wish they don't actually show midterms on here. These dots are just the four presidential.
Yeah, but they'd be around like probably 60 million or so, like half.
Yeah, so again, I think from introspection, what's sort of driving me to make those different decisions is kind of how much I kind of just personally care about these elections. I think there also aren't any very close local elections. So in Tompkins County, we're in this very bizarre situation where anything that's local to the city of Ithaca, the Democrats get to trounce everyone. For everything in our congressional district, the Republicans get to trounce everyone. And then everything statewide, the Democrats get to trounce everyone. So we're actually not competitive at all on different things. And yeah, so really, so not only do I often vote, but when I get away with it, I will give myself a personal voting holiday and not work on election day. Just because I think, so that's actually, that's a rare thing about the United States. The voting is not a national holiday. In fact, in most sort of advanced democracies, it's a holiday. So I think that's a good thing. And so my personal protest is to not work. I don't know if that's a costly protest or a anti-costly protest. But yeah, so I mean, the broader point, I don't know, I don't mean for this to sort of soften my position. But I think the fact that sort of very decisively your vote doesn't matter in a sense certainly doesn't mean that you shouldn't vote. It means that you shouldn't vote if what you care about is affecting outcomes. That's kind of silly. But if you want to vote, if you think it's sort of important to you, I think it's kind of silly for me to say no, it shouldn't be important to you. Again, if you think, oh no, I'm going to go out and vote because I think it's sort of likely that I'm going to change who wins, then I might tell you, yeah, it's kind of silly. But if you sort of think it's important, and historically, if you're a member of a group that was historically not allowed to vote, and you sort of think it's important to take advantage of that, I mean, I'm not going to tell you you're an idiot for going out and voting if you sort of are going to enjoy it. I think that's not really the point I'm trying to make. The point is again purely about the instrumental motivations.
So, if a celebrity who has, let's say, a large social media presence or can influence a large amount of people, if they get a congregation with like another group of celebrities and they do like a turn out and vote campaign, does their individual vote and the fact that they're campaigning for votes, does that matter?
So I mean, sure, you can always scale up the influence or something. So, but it's not their actual vote that's affecting things. It's their the things that they're saying. So certainly, what a presidential candidate does during the campaign is going to affect votes. That might matter. But again, I just think that's sort of different than the question that we're discussing.
But if they didn't vote, for example, then wouldn't that be like providing a bad example to others? So let's say they go on voting day, they take a sticker, they post it on Instagram, they have 10 million followers. Does that not have influence?
Sure, yeah. So I guess that would be a case where I don't know if people have studied the effect that have. I would still guess there that the effect of one celebrity putting on Instagram that they voted is probably gonna maybe influence the number of votes in the order of the thousands. And again, in most elections like this, that's still, even again, for the most influential people, pretty unlikely to swing things. And you can think, there's sort of a lot of celebrities that are being, so it's hard to differentiate the effect of one celebrity doing that. There's probably a lot of celebrities doing it, there's a lot of celebrities not doing it. So that's sort of a difficult quantity to estimate. I can't imagine it's to really fundamentally change the equation. Yeah.
Would your argument change if we had a multi-party system or not viable third-party candidate?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let's really talk more broadly about putting this in sort of a comparative perspective. So I was just talking about the United States. So one important point to bring up, this is actually related to my research, is that historically, most elections have been not remotely close at all. Most elections throughout the world in the past 200 years, like 55-45 is an extremely close election in the grand scheme of things. So even the case where, at 100 your chance of battering goes to 0, that's closer than most elections. That's sort of one point. So the other point is different institutional features. So if we're in a parliamentary system, and I'm voting, it's not necessarily, again, it's going to vary a lot by setting, but what you're thinking about is not necessarily, I'm voting for president, but I'm voting for my member of parliament, which is going to affect the number of members of that party which make it into parliament, which could affect whether or not they get into the coalition and sort of have influence over policy making. And so again there, even though those kind of individual pivot events may be more likely, so even if like my vote is only mattering in my district, again, there's sort of a tiny chance my vote's going to change what happens in the district. There's sort of a tiny chance that what happens in the district is going to, meaningfully change the number of seats that my party has. which might affect whether or not they get into the coalition. And then if they get into the ruling coalition, does their presence in the ruling coalition actually change the coalition policy? So sort of, changes the exact way that we would go about doing the calculation, but not really the.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Did you have one more slide you wanted to?
Oh, no.
Yeah, sorry, going off my previous question. So if we've already kind of discussed if PB is negligible, and if we were in Minnesota in your college days and C is negligible as well, then it all comes down to D, right? And I think D is what's really important in when we should vote, and I think D should be high for everyone. Therefore, your vote really should matter, and you should go out to vote. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's just sort of kind of a terminology. I mean, if you think that D, so why do you think D is high or should be high?
Well, it goes back, if D is like some intrinsic value you put into voting, well, it goes back to this idea of it's your civic duty, or if you're part of a democracy, or if you're part of the call yourself American, I think part of that obligation comes with voting. Yeah, I guess you can't really put a number to that, but I feel like that feeling should somewhat be in every American. If 6 times as many people voted in American Idol than actual viewers, it's actually a really low number. If there's 320 million people in America, that's like what? A bit over 33% election turnout.
So the reason why that's a bit lower is because so this is when we talk about turnout, that's eligible voters. So a lot of people vote.
Okay, that's right. That's fair. But still, I just think that number's too low.
I mean, again, I think that's sort of, in a sense, not directly related to the question at hand, right? So again, I mean, obviously your vote matters in the sense that it affects like the events of what you do during a particular day. And so if we're sort of thinking on the individual level of like, how does it affect my life in terms of what I do, then it's just sort of not an interesting question. Because of course, everything you do matters in the sense that it like affects what you do for part of your day. Really, I think the way to make the question interesting is again to think about how your individual action affects the aggregate. And again, I think even if you sort of think this value of this thing in democracy is important, your individual vote is barely changing turnout. So it's not really affecting whether our democracy is functioning, whether one individual person votes. So yeah, I think it's sort of partially just a question of how we interpret the question. But again, by the way that people typically interpret this question, I think the point you're making doesn't really mean people's voters.
Okay. So at this point, we're going to have a discussion. Let's give Professor Little a round of applause. So we'll have about 10 minutes of discussion here, and then we will have a vote, but don't feel pressured to vote if you don't think your vote matters.
Yeah, so everyone should abstain. Can you make abstain an option? Is that allowed?
Sure, yeah, we have abstentions as well. So if you want to abstain, but we have a small magnitude here, so there's a good chance it's going to matter. Let's start out. Who's got something to say?
I would agree with Professor Little because particularly, addressing the question if your individual vote affects the aggregate, it does not, especially not with thousands of voters and in presidential elections, millions of voters. Your single vote probably doesn't matter. Of course, when you're talking about does it matter to you for democratic reasons? Sure, but I think that's like Professor Little said, a different question.
Yeah. Kevin?
So I'm also going to say no, and I think that one of the main reasons why, especially in like presidential elections, it doesn't matter is because of the electoral college. I know that in certain states that, especially in my state, Massachusetts, it's always going to swing Democrats. It doesn't matter if I vote or not because we've always got Democrats. Even when Ronald Reagan was running for office in every other state in the country, I think, when Republican, we were the only ones who continued to go Democrat. So it's one of those things where you know that if you're in certain areas, your vote doesn't matter as much as it would perhaps if it was just an open system.
But to counter that point, I think it does matter. I think your vote does matter even if you're in a single-party majority state like Massachusetts, because it affects how the politician is elected is going to consider the opposition when they're looking to pass legislation. So maybe if Massachusetts ran 70% Democrat for gubernatorial race, the governor wouldn't have to think about public inducements at all. If it was a 52-48 type of deal, then they'd have to consider what their reelection chances would be. So they'd have to consider the opposition. So I think that's
I agree with that as well. We're only talking about right now in the presidential elections, but there's so many different types of elections, whether it's county, like legislature, where, I mean, we saw the data. If there's a smaller electorate, that your vote definitely does matter more. And like Troy was talking about the gubernatorial elections, like Massachusetts, yes, it is a very much a safe blue state, but it's elected red governors, Mitt Romney. It's had red, senators. So, yeah.
I would say it does matter because coming from one of the counties that did come down to pretty much deciding the election in 2000 when there's literally hundreds of people, it could have made the difference if you and 100 friends go out and vote.
I think the electoral college can also be an argument for yes. If you come from a swing state, you might feel that your vote matters even more.
I'd say your vote does matter because individual votes make up larger collective movements and larger collective interests, and it takes all those votes combined to represent a significant interest that can influence an election.
Okay, so a group of individuals is what constitutes.
I would actually disagree with Hassan's point about the electoral college being on the yes side, but actually put the electoral college as a factor of why your vote does not matter. Even if you and your friends and everyone else voted according to your position and whatever, at the end of the day, it could be some guy who just chooses to vote a different way and outside the election.
Okay. But that's only true in Nebraska.
Right. But taking those states into account, it would not matter.
Nice. Yes, sir.
It's more likely, I was saying no, it doesn't matter because it's more likely that the electoral college actually has more comprehensive understanding of the relevant issues for a particular election. So, regarding the popular vote, someone could, really be a one-issue vote. Whereas in the electoral college, you have someone who has a more comprehensive understanding of the issues.
Okay, but the electoral college represents the popular vote of the state. So whichever candidate wins the popular vote of the state, the electoral college will vote for that candidate for the national election, except for in Maine and Nebraska, they can split. I think maybe Kentucky can do that as well. They did that in the 1800s. That's like a Lincoln thing. All right. Anybody else?
Just on a note of the electoral college, I mean, not necessarily does it always go with the popular vote. I mean, it's like the 2000 election, go with the popular vote, it will end up on Bush.
Yeah, I'm saying on state level. So yeah, popular vote can be greater for the national election and then you can still lose the election. So I guess that brings. Yeah.
I think that the idea, Professor Little argued that if what you're working for, if you contribute towards something, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the bottom line, then you shouldn't bother doing it at all. I think that kind of logic is dangerous. I mean, it's like saying, why give to an AIDS charity if your money's not going to cure AIDS? Well, no, it probably won't, but it's going to go towards something that you believe in. I think that aspect of voting is important. It's not necessarily about changing the outcome. I think everybody knows that no, their vote isn't going to be the deciding vote, except in very extreme circumstances. But like you wrote on the board, it's about working towards something that you believe in. I mean, that's has intrinsic value.
I would agree with that. Anybody else? Okay. At this point, we will do a vote. Do you have the ballots?
Yes.
Okay. We will hand out the ballots, and like I said, I still believe your vote doesn't matter.
Sounds good. Well, its cost is pretty low. So you use secret ballot.
Yeah, we'll even deliver the ballots to you, no registration necessary. No driver's license, no literacy test.
Yeah. Oh, do I get to?
Sure.
Why, it would be, it would be incredible.
Ballot?
Okay.
Okay, so once again, let's all give Professor Little one last round. We really appreciate it. You made a very compelling argument. We'll see if it was enough to sway our audience.
So, can I give my plug to my class next semester? So, yeah, so I'm teaching a game theory class next semester. So if you find this stuff interesting, there's still a few seats. We actually pumped up the cap because a lot of people signed up. So I'll definitely be teaching it next semester and maybe again next year. So if you definitely want to take it, make sure you do it next semester. There might be a chance next year as well. Yeah.
What is this class called? Like, is it,
It's called game theory and politics.
like, what's the level of the course?
I think it's a 2,000 class.
Oh,
So once again, we are planning on organizing one of these debates every week next semester. We're going to be bringing in some very exciting speakers from around the country. Our first speaker of next semester, right away in February, is going to be General George Casey. He is the former Army Chief of Staff under President Obama during the war in Afghanistan. So it should be pretty exciting to have such a high-ranking military official speak. So we're all looking forward to that event. I think Nate has the final tally.
Okay, so the votes were pretty close. They almost mattered. But from a vote of 8 to 5 with 1 abstention, we have gone against Professor Little's word and decided that your vote does matter.
We get to take game theory now.